I am Luna, 32 years old, living with my husband and son. I joined the company as a new graduate and have been working there for 10 years now. When I gave birth, I took maternity leave, but I returned to work immediately after my son turned 1, and I continue to work vigorously in a sales position. Thanks to my hard work, I am on the verge of a promotion, and recently, work has become even more enjoyable. On the other hand, my husband, who is 3 years younger, has been restless and changing jobs even before we got married. He aims to start his own business someday, believing that to become a future entrepreneur, it's essential to gain skills by working in various companies rather than staying in one place. However, when I look at my husband's current situation, his salary decreases with each job change. I have doubts about whether he is truly improving his skills. Despite that, I felt it was my responsibility to support our household while encouraging my husband's dreams. I wanted to believe in his potential. However, my husband betrayed me. He used an unthinkable method to trap me. During the first couple of years of our marriage, my husband and I got along well. Our life wasn't easy due to his unstable job, but spending time with my husband dreaming about building our own home and traveling abroad was enjoyable. However, things changed after I gave birth to our son. My husband became noticeably cold towards me. Looking back, perhaps he hadn't changed much himself. It was having a child that made me realize his true nature. While my husband had never been keen on household chores, he particularly disliked childcare. When I was on maternity or childcare leave and stayed at home, things were manageable. But once I returned to work after my childcare leave, my days became a whirlwind. I woke up early to prepare breakfast for my family and take our son to daycare. After work, I rushed to pick him up, did the grocery shopping, and prepared dinner. I barely had time to catch my breath. I could have used an extra pair of hands. Yet, my husband seemed oblivious to my struggles. Despite having more free time than I did, he adamantly refused to take our son to daycare. When I asked him why, he said he didn't want to be perceived as someone with too much free time if he did the school run as a father. I tried to convince him that it's perfectly normal for men to be involved in parenting these days. In fact, I saw plenty of fathers in suits doing school drop-offs at the daycare. However, no matter what I said, my husband remained stubbornly resistant. Avoiding arguments, I eventually gave in. Balancing work, household chores, and childcare was tough for me, especially with early mornings and overtime at the office. But I persevered for the sake of our family. It would have been helpful if there were someone who could admonish my husband. Unfortunately, the only person he fears, my father-in-law, is currently away on a business trip. My father-in-law always praised me for balancing work and household chores, understanding the demands of my job. Even when my pregnancy was confirmed, he advised my husband,
"Take good care of Luna."
However, shortly after our son was born, my father-in-law was transferred far away. My mother-in-law stayed behind in our hometown. Unfortunately, unlike my father-in-law, she dotes on her son excessively and only takes my husband's side, so I couldn't rely on her at all. With her extensive experience as a homemaker, my mother-in-law didn't seem pleased that I continued working after giving birth. Additionally, she must have been bothered by the fact that her own son kept changing jobs without making significant progress. It seems she felt frustrated that I, as the daughter-in-law, achieved more in my career. Every time we met, she made snide remarks about me prioritizing work over my roles as a wife and mother. While she surely knows that my work contributes to our current lifestyle, she still criticized me. Eventually, she started saying absurd things like how it's pitiful to leave my child at daycare until late or that I should quit my job altogether. Perhaps my mother-in-law's idle time during my father-in-law's business trips fueled her behavior. She would casually drop by our house, deliver her barbs, and leave. Although I felt unfairly blamed, I resigned myself to the fact that some people with outdated views might never understand. Unfortunately, my husband seemed to resent my professional success. When I received a raise for my efforts, I excitedly shared the news with him, hoping for at least a congratulatory word. Instead, his response was a dismissive.
Oh, really?
It hurt. As time went on, my husband's attitude worsened. He started berating me, saying things like,
Don't get too full of yourself just because you're earning a bit more.
The constant criticism from my husband and even my mother-in-law left me questioning why I was working so hard every day. I began regretting my decision to marry him. To make matters worse, my husband's late nights became routine. Despite working at a factory where he should have regular hours, he often returned home well past midnight. When I asked him why, he always claimed it was work-related. I didn't believe that could be true, but whenever I tried to inquire further, he'd become irritable. So I refrained from pressing the issue, but I couldn't help feeling suspicious about his unnatural behavior. And then, finally, an incident occurred. One evening, my mother-in-law suddenly dropped by our house unannounced. While her impromptu visits were nothing new, that particular day left me feeling utterly drained. You see, earlier in the day, there had been a daycare sports event, and I had worked late, waking up early to prepare lunch boxes. I was exhausted and had planned to go to bed early, especially since an important business meeting awaited me the next morning. My son, worn out from the sports event, had already dozed off in his bedroom after dinner. However, with my mother-in-law's arrival, I couldn't simply retire for the night. Determined, I dragged my tired body to the kitchen to prepare some tea. However, at that moment, my husband suddenly grabbed my arm tightly. Surprised, I looked at his face.
You must be tired, so I'll take care of it.
My husband rarely steps into the kitchen, so I was taken aback. Normally, he insists that I handle everything, cooking, cleaning, and more, no matter how exhausted I am from work. Perhaps he wanted to impress my mother-in-law. I thought it was probably just empty words, so I ignored him and headed back to the kitchen. But my husband wouldn't let go of my arm. This time, with a stern tone.
Just sit down and rest.
He forcibly seated me on the sofa. I felt trapped. If I allowed my husband to make tea for me, I knew my mother-in-law would have something to say. Surely, she'd criticize me for being a demanding wife. However, to my surprise, even my mother-in-law chimed in.
Luna, it's okay to sit.
She gently held me down and smiled. While I conversed with my mother-in-law, my husband went into the kitchen and started brewing tea. Something is amiss. There's no way both of them suddenly had a change of heart. What's going on today? As I pondered my suspicions, my husband approached with a teacup on a tray.
Well, have some tea.
He placed the cup in front of me, smiling. I thanked him while keeping a close eye on his behavior. It seemed my husband kept glancing at me. Even my mother-in-law appeared more restless than usual. Definitely strange. I lowered my gaze to the tea my husband had brewed. I see now. He must be up to something. Yes, there had to be a reason behind their unnatural kindness. I wasn't about to fall into their trap. No more mercy. I was ready. I lifted the teacup but paused just before taking a sip. By the way, didn't we have some tea snacks in the fridge? Let's offer them to Mom, I said, facing my husband. Normally, my husband wouldn't bother serving tea snacks to guests. But today, after telling me to rest, he had no choice but to comply. Initially bewildered, he eventually conceded.
Oh, right.
He headed back to the kitchen to fetch the treats. My mother-in-law followed suit, saying,
Oh dear. Thanks.
I seized the opportunity. As my husband returned with the tea snacks, I finally took a sip from the teacup. My mother-in-law, sitting next to me, also began sipping her tea. We engaged in light conversation for a while, showing my son's sports day videos to my mother-in-law. However, both my husband and mother-in-law continued to stare at me unnaturally. Despite feeling their sharp gazes, I calmly finished my tea. Observing my composure, my husband tilted his head in confusion. Just when I thought everything would proceed without incident, a sudden change occurred. My mother-in-law's complexion darkened, and she furrowed her brow. Then, she clutched her stomach and rushed out of the living room with surprising speed. Her destination? The bathroom, of course. I had suspected something was amiss, and now it seemed my intuition was correct. Glancing at my husband, his eyes remain wide open, and he looks utterly bewildered. Then, in an instant, he shoots me a piercing glare and hurries to follow my mother-in-law. As he pounds on the bathroom door, he calls out,
Mom, are you okay?
From inside the bathroom, my mother-in-law emitted pained groans, though I couldn't quite make out her words. Well, I could imagine the situation fairly well. A few minutes later, my husband returned to the living room, leaving my mother-in-law in the bathroom. His face had turned pale, and he nervously bit his lip. I addressed him. You know, it seems you put something quite suspicious in my tea. His eyes widened, and he exclaimed,
So it was you after all.
I chuckled and replied, No. It was you, wasn't it? Since the tea you served me seemed incredibly dubious, I discreetly swapped it with your mom's. My husband spat out.
You're a terrible wife. Suspecting me.
I couldn't help but burst into laughter. Well, who's worse, really? I retorted. You probably spiked it with laxatives or something. The strange powder clinging to the rim and inside of the teacup gave it away. Indeed, there was a faint white powdery substance on the cup. If my husband were someone who regularly brewed tea, I might not have been suspicious. But he never did any household chores, and my mother-in-law believed it was only natural to boss me around. The fact that both of them went out of their way to make me rest was highly unlikely. So, I had been carefully observing my husband's actions and the tea he served. My husband's ill-conceived plot was exposed, and he confessed everything. However, the motive behind his attempt to spike my drink with a laxative was so trivial that it left me utterly bewildered. Apparently, upon learning that I had an important business meeting the next day, he conspired with my mother-in-law to sabotage my work. If their plan had succeeded, I would have either cancelled the meeting due to illness or found myself repeatedly rushing to the bathroom during negotiations with our client. Such a situation could have negatively impacted my professional reputation at the company. Yet, tampering with someone's beverage is undeniably a criminal act. Why would both my husband and mother-in-law go to such lengths to undermine me? I find their actions pitiable. After being completely exposed and defiant, my husband glared at me.
If anything happens to Mom, I'll demand compensation.
But I retorted, What are you talking about? You're the one who should pay compensation. I chuckled and added, I know you've been cheating all along. His expression froze in an instant, Despite having plenty of free time, he always claimed to be busy with work, returning home late. Even on his days off, he'd go out alone, leaving almost no time for family. When he was home, he'd be glued to his smartphone. Suspicious of his infidelity, I hired a private investigator to track his actions. The results were as expected. My husband had been deceiving me. He pretended to be single at a mixer, got close to a young woman, and spun tales about upcoming business ventures. She, fresh out of school and naive, fell for his lies. Later, my husband tried to justify it, claiming that dating a younger woman boosted his confidence. I could almost picture him puffing up, bragging about his future as a CEO. But if he had that much free time, he should have put more effort into achieving his goals. Instead, it seemed my husband, like a spoiled child, was chasing an impossible dream of entrepreneurship. Surprisingly, my husband, caught in his infidelity, turned pale and froze. I looked him straight in the eye. "Let's get a divorce. You'll pay alimony, of course, and child support." His defeated response was,
Fine, whatever.
but then he tried to assert himself.
Just so you know, if we divorce, I'll take half of our savings. I know you've been secretly hoarding money.
I chuckled and sighed. "You won't get a share of my assets. Most of the remaining savings are from when I was single. The pre-marriage savings aren't subject to division." He retorted.
What? That can't be true. Besides, you've been earning lately.
I decided to enlighten him. "The recent earnings have mostly gone toward living expenses since you contribute very little." His face fell. Then I added, "By the way, every piece of furniture and every appliance in this house was bought with my money. So don't even think about taking them when you leave. This house is in my name, so please gather your belongings and leave." As my mother-in-law emerged from the bathroom looking defeated, I told her, "I'll be informing your husband about this." She pleaded,
Please. Don't tell him.
but I didn't hesitate. I contacted my father-in-law. Naturally, he was furious, and my mother-in-law was handed a swift divorce. Afterward, realizing that he couldn't expect any share of the assets, my husband finally understood his predicament. Despite pleading with me, saying he didn't want to separate and that he couldn't live without me, his apologies now hold no sway over my feelings. I hired a lawyer, and the divorce with my husband was finalized successfully. I claimed substantial compensation for emotional distress and child support. Due to his low income, my husband couldn't pay the compensation in one lump sum, and he ended up burdened with significant debt. But the punishment meted out to him wasn't limited to that. Since I filed a police report about the laxative incident in my tea, both my husband and mother-in-law were convicted of assault. Although they received probation, they now share a criminal record. In the end, my husband was also rejected by his affair partner, and he works tirelessly day and night to repay his debts. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law, abandoned by my father-in-law, leads a miserable life in poverty. They tried to undermine me with baseless jealousy, but they reaped what they sowed. On the other hand, my recent business negotiation was a great success, and I was promoted to lead the sales team. I moved out of the apartment I shared with my husband and rented a new condominium. Now, my son and I live happily together. Although my first marriage ended in failure, I'll continue working diligently and ensure my happiness. Farewell, everyone.
How did you find this story? Please consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, take care.